I'd like to begin by telling you a little bit about me. I worked as a paediatrician caring for children and families with CF for about 30 years in Leeds, and during that period I think I must have cared for around about 1,000 children and families with cystic fibrosis, and the change over that period was quite remarkable. And during that time I really did have quite a relationship with the CF Trust, and I think the CF Trust was absolutely central to enabling CF care in the UK to develop as it has developed. CF care is generally quite rich in terms of the MDT, in terms of physios and dietitians, psychologists and social workers and bricks and mortar, and a large part of that has been due to the CF Trust working in partnership with the clinical teams. And I think because of that, the sort of standard of care, the improvement in lifestyle and lifespan have been really quite impressive. Now, this evening I've been asked to talk to you about what the CF Trust does, and that's my job really, to deliver impact to people with CF. I left being a paediatrician about 2 years ago and was persuaded to come back and work for the CF Trust, and I've really enjoyed it because I think the Trust makes a massive difference in many different areas. In some ways, too many areas, and I'll go over those this evening. But I really do think it makes a big difference. And this is a small audience, so if you want to ask questions as we go through, please feel free to put your hand up or shout out, and I'll answer any questions if I can. Right, I cover these different areas, and as you can see, they're quite a number. Policy, the registry. Can I ask, how many people have heard of the registry in this room, just out of interest? A few, right. The registry I'll talk about in a bit more detail, but it is unique. It really is. It contains demographic data and clinical data on virtually everybody in the UK and people in the Channel Islands who get their care in the UK. And that data is presented in terms of an annual report every year, and there's all sorts of plans for the registry which I'll talk about. It enables research and also funding. Again, I'll talk about that. The CF Trust began life as a research charity, and research is by far and away the biggest spend that the CF Trust actually makes. And some of those areas I'll talk about in a little bit of detail, but there are many areas that have made a big difference over the years. I'm also responsible for information and support. So information is providing written information, standards of care, guidelines, information leaflets for families. And following on from what Mike was saying, the biggest downloaded information resource that we produce is the fertility pack, and that's fantastic. That really does reflect how far CF has come over the years. But we have other resources as well. Involvement, we are very keen that people with CF, like Tim Watton, are involved in everything that we do. And Tim works for the CF Trust and works for CTAP, or did work for CTAP until quite recently. But we want people with CF to be involved in the CF Trust and to inform everything that we do. I'm also responsible for the Clinical Trials Accelerator platform, and I'll talk about that in a bit of detail because I think that's new and that's really exciting and very important. CF is at a unique stage at the moment because it's got the interest and the focus of the pharmaceutical companies, and that hasn't been the case in the past. And it's believed that that interest and focus is quite time limited. So there's an opportunity to get new molecules for the benefit of people with CF, and that's what we're trying to do. I'll cover that in a bit more detail as we go through. So I'm going to cover an awful lot of different areas. So as I say, if you want to ask questions, please feel free to as we go through. Right, this has already been alluded to. In the UK, the NHS is feeling quite challenging times. We heard about difficulties for Mike's daughter in terms of admission into Southampton, and that's true all over the UK. And part of that is the increase in numbers of adults with CF, which is a great success, but stresses the service. But because of the general ageing of the population, there's a demand on beds. And CF and that MDT is getting gradually squashed in the UK. So there's big challenges going forward. And also in terms of getting staffing, if you reflect on what Mike said about the numbers of adults with CF, it's unrealistic to expect that there'll be a similar increase in numbers of consultants and physios and dietitians and so forth. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we go forward. Now, I realise that this is applicable to the UK, but in some ways it's applicable to you as well, because any patient who gets care in the UK and is on the registry is banded. In other words, their care is costed. And this is the amount of money NHS England gives to the centre who delivers care. And I show you this graph for a few reasons. Firstly, to illustrate in real terms, the amount of money is actually going down year on year. The banding reflects the severity of the illness and the medication people with CF are on. So a new diagnosis will actually be 1A because it's the first year of life. But once things are steady and settled, most new babies with CF will be band 1. And that's the money the centre gets for providing that care. Now, the other reason I show you this is because it gives you some idea of the cost in relation to the cost of new medications that are coming out and the challenges that that actually presents. You know, when you're talking about some of the treatments that are coming along that are £100,000 per year per patient, if you look at the maximum a centre can get for delivering traditional care, there's a disconnect. And that's a big challenge. And one of the challenges that the CF Trust is absolutely determined to try to address. And again, I'll talk about that as we go through. Now, again, Mike alluded to this, and I did a little bit, but again, I want to emphasise it really. 11,000 people in the UK with cystic fibrosis, and when I started, it was largely a paediatric condition. But now there's more adults than children, and the numbers are expected to increase significantly. So in 2012, there was 5,000 adults with CF in the UK. And that's expected to go up to 8,000 by about 2025. And that increase is going to be a real challenge, as I've said, in terms of bricks and mortar and in terms of staff, particularly when you consider about cross-infection issues and segregation. And there's a real need to look at the current model of care, you know, the sort of cross-sectional care where people go to clinic every 6 weeks or every 3 months for a review, whether they need to or not. We need to move to a more reactive model of care. And I think that addresses some of the issues Mike was talking about in terms of how care is delivered in the Channel Islands and how things might be done differently in the future. At the moment, the standards of care describe exactly what should be delivered, but in some ways that's a little bit of a straitjacket, but it is a baseline. And we are working with clinicians and commissioners at looking at other ways of delivering care, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through.
Question?
Yeah, by all means.
The numbers of 16 to 18-year-olds looks like it's going down slightly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Multifactorial screening. If you have a baby diagnosed early because of screening, that influences reproductive choices. So you are less likely to have another child with cystic fibrosis. Second is the change in the genetic pool within the UK, we think. A lot of immigration of young couples having children who are less likely to have CF because the gene frequency is different. And a few other factors as well, but we're not quite sure of. But it's definitely going down slightly, which is interesting, but it doesn't release much in the way of capacity. And you know, paediatrics and adults are very different, and there's no adolescent centres as such in the UK. Again, this is very UK focused, but it sort of highlights, I've shown you this slide really to show you some of the challenges. Up till recently, the way that the CF community, people with CF and the clinicians actually got access to new treatments and extra money was through something called the clinical reference group. So there's a group that was specifically for cystic fibrosis, and that was incredibly good at getting new treatments. It was almost a representative group. And how many people here have heard of Kaleidocor, ivacaftor? Yeah. You know, this is really important because it illustrates the potential out there. About 4% of people with CF have the gene G551D, okay? Now, this treatment, Kaleido, was introduced about 5 years or so ago, and it almost converts somebody with CF to somebody without CF. You know, practicing as a paediatrician, it was quite remarkable. People would start on this tablet that's taken twice a day, and they'd come in and they'd say they didn't realise how unwell they felt before they had the treatment. There'd be a 15% improvement in lung function, weight gain would go up, activity levels would go up, and they just felt totally different. Now that's fantastic, brilliant treatment, but it's only applicable for those 4% with that specific mutation. But there's a big pipeline of treatment out there that's potentially going to have the same impact for the whole spectrum of mutations. But the challenge of that is actually funding it. But the reason I raise that is because when the CRG was specifically CF, we managed to get that treatment paid for and introduced into the UK. The CRG is now split, and the CRG now covers all of these different areas as well as CF. So it's become more of a competitive environment, and it's much more difficult for us to actually influence getting all of those new treatments and the additional costs that have been incurred. And that's one of the challenges the Trust faces. But we have representation on that CRG. One of my colleagues, Nick Medhurst, who's head of policy, actually represents the CF Trust as a patient representative body on the CRG. So the first area that I'm particularly responsible for, policy. You know, this is where we try to develop our own policies but influence other people's policies as well. And there's several areas that we are working on. You know, areas like travel insurance we've had quite a lot of success in. Transplant is another area that is about to change. The news is embargoed, so I can't tell you at the moment, but the process for giving transplanted organs out is going to change in the very near future in the UK, and that will be to your advantage. In fact, it will be to everybody's advantage because of the way it's going to change. At the moment, it's zonal, so if organs become available in your area, that the transplant centre that covers your area serves, then that centre has the first option for those organs. But it is going to change and it will be better. Unfortunately, I can't tell you about that. And I've already talked about lobbying for high-cost care, which is something that we do an awful lot of and we have some success in, particularly the ivacaftor, in G551D, in other mutations and in other age ranges as well. Right, care. I mentioned before that the CF Trust, working in partnership with clinical teams, had been very good at leveraging resources into CF centres, the physiotherapists and dietitians, etc. But because of the changes in NHS England, that ability to leverage those resources had been diminished somewhat. But we still have influence, and these are the main ways that we have influence in delivering care through the centres. We conduct a patient experience survey, so we ask people with CF how easy it is to see a dietitian when they need to, how easy it is to see a physio when they need to, how easy it is to be admitted, how long do they have to wait for a bed when they need one. So we can build up a national picture about what the experience of having CF is, and the important questions have been developed by people with CF and the allied health professionals. And we can build up a national picture, so we can look to see whether it's changing as resources become more stretched, or whether those experiences are remaining reasonably steady. And we can also look for outliers in different clinics and work to enhance the resources and the processes in those outliers if we need to. We also are doing a staffing audit tool, so we are looking at the number of dietitians per person with CF across all of the centres and so forth, so we can keep an eye on the staffing to make sure that it seems to be appropriate to the standards of care and the service specifications, and that isn't being changed with the stretching of resources. We fund training fellows. We fund an awful lot of training fellows. In fact, a lot of the CF clinicians out there in centres at the moment, in adult centres, were previously fellows funded by us. We provide a grant of about 70,000 for a year's training in CF. So somebody, after they've finished training as a respiratory consultant, can specialise in CF for a year and then go on to be a CF centre doctor. And they are very popular, and as I say, a lot of the current consultants have gone through that scheme. We've just started with the physiotherapy fellowship. We promoted that last year. So we fund a physiotherapist to come out of their post and to gain specific CF experience all over the country. And again, that has been incredibly popular. We had over 15 applicants for one post, and we're going to run that again this year. And we provide small grants for clinical improvement, for quality improvement, for specific bits of equipment of around about £15,000 to £75,000 for a 2-year matched funding project. So these are areas where we try to influence how care is actually delivered and maintain the quality of care. I mentioned before that
on that funding point, if something were to be done locally by perhaps our health department, would funding for the, sort of joint funding for that be a possibility as well?
Yes. If the clinical excellence awards, that has to be applied for via a centre director. But if there's matched funding available, then that's absolutely fine. And there's examples of what you say in the Cambridge area. The centre director actually applied, but the funding is actually going somewhere else, over towards Norwich.
Yeah, the question obviously was for Guernsey as not in the UK, but within
Right.
the remit, so whether it's applicable here in Guernsey as well.
I don't know, I'd have to look at that. There are, going back to Mike's presentation, which I think was absolutely inspirational, and providing exercise and grants for supporting activity, that's something I'm absolutely passionate about. But, there is this challenge between how much we as a UK organisation can support individuals in Guernsey. And, the charity that you're setting up is absolutely ideal for that. Going back to research, I said before that this is one of the biggest areas of spending, somewhere in the region of 4 to 5 million. The biggest areas are these SRCs, the Strategic Research Centres, and we run a programme every year where we offer 3 or sometimes 4 lots of funding of £750,000. And these are to encourage people who don't necessarily do research in CF to get together and to collaborate in the UK and abroad. We fund people in France, in Australia, in Canada, all over the world, working in collaboration in virtual centres to deliver specific projects. And this research strategy was developed by one of my colleagues, Janet Allen, and it's been really, really successful. It's developed some superb quality research projects. And I'll talk about that next. We also have the VIA, the Venture Innovation Awards. That's a pot of money of about £500,000, which we again give out to encourage, with matched funding or with leveraged funding, research all over the UK and the world. We fund some summer studentships for PhD students to specifically concentrate on CF. All this is about pulling researchers into CF to try to get the brightest and the best doing CF research. And we fund something called sandpits, which is where we pull specialists from all sorts of different areas that may be related together into a room for 3 days to brainstorm how they may address particular issues. And one of the sandpits we ran last year was looking at GI issues, gastrointestinal issues in CF. So we tried to get them to think laterally, to look at different ways of addressing some of the tummy ache and bloating and malabsorption that people with CF can still suffer from, even despite the enzymes and the modern treatments. So our focus is very much research, and it's moved on a long way. These are examples of some of the SRCs that we've funded over the last few years. You'll notice that exercise is one of them, physical activity, exercise, sport, promotion for adolescents with cystic fibrosis. You know, how do you encourage people with CF to be more active? You know, I think it's hard enough for all of us to be active, but if you don't feel 100% and you've got all your treatment to do as well, it's even harder. So how can you just make things a little bit easier for people to get involved in activity? And clearly grants is one of those ways. But this is a really big investment from us to try to investigate ways of improving it. And we have other exercise programs as well. We're looking at better ways of detecting and actually treating Pseudomonas. Pseudomonas, as many of you will know, is one of the infections that you can get in the airway. Most people with CF do get it eventually, and it can be eradicated and stay away for several years before it comes back. And that's associated with much better outcomes. And we're looking at better ways of identifying it and treating it. Mycobacterium abscessus is another infection that you can get in the airways, and we're looking at ways of identifying that and treating it and eradicating that as well. I mentioned the registry before, and the EpiNet is looking at all of that big data because it's a wealth of data. It goes back to 2007 for virtually everybody with CF, demographic and clinical outcomes. And we're doing all sorts of analysis on that using machine learning and artificial intelligence to learn what works, a sort of different way of looking at things other than just randomized controlled trials. And then there's looking at cell therapies and stem cells and genetic engineering, and of course gene therapy as well. All sorts of different areas. I think it's an incredibly broad and balanced portfolio, but it's going to be these kind of investments that will make a difference going forward. Right, the Clinical Trials Accelerator platform, I mentioned this before. The pharmaceutical industry is really interested in CF at the moment because of that example of Kalydeco or ivacaftor. And there's a whole pipeline of drugs that the pharmaceutical companies have developed that may be beneficial for the whole spectrum of mutations. There's a lot of optimism that just as people with G551D have benefited from Kalydeco, people with 508 will benefit from similar medications going forward. You know, Orkambi is one of those treatments, but not quite as effective as Kalydeco. Now, when I worked as a paediatrician, I must put my hand up and say I was guilty of sort of shielding patients from being enrolled in clinical trials. You know, I felt that the burden of care was too much, and I wasn't enthusiastic about offering clinical trials. In my defense, I think a lot of the medications that were coming through were nowhere near as beneficial as the new ones are promising to be. But we believe there's a real need to change the culture for clinical teams to include offering people with CF to be involved in clinical trials as part of routine care. There's no doubt that if you are involved in a trial, outcomes improve, even if you're in the placebo arm. So being involved in trials is a good thing per se. But of course it's the way to find the treatments, the Kalydecos of the future. So we need to change the culture of the clinicians. I think we need to change the culture of people with CF to recognise that it's a good thing being involved in trials and to volunteer to be involved in trials as well. And the Trust has invested about £3 million into this platform where we have organised centres, CTAP centres around the UK and given resource clinical trial coordinators as part of a network to facilitate this process of offering and delivering pharmaceutical trials. Southampton is one of the CTAP centres, and there's every reason why Southampton would offer people in the Channel Islands to be involved in those studies. The pharmaceutical companies are keen for people with CF to participate because there's relatively limited number of people with CF, and there's a real possibility that if we don't get the throughput into these trials, we'll miss out on this focus of the pharmaceutical industry on CF research. So this is not about coercing, it's offering the opportunity and encouraging people to be involved should they wish to. And other elements of CTAP are all about providing information to people with CF, what it's like being involved in a trial, what the commitment is and why it's a good idea. And also showing people with CF what trials are open in the UK, what trials they may wish to be involved in should they wish. And I was talking to one of my colleagues in Brisbane, Claire Wainwright, and they provide clinical trials to patients that they care for 400 miles away. The pharmaceutical companies pay for travel for people to go to the centres to participate in trials they want to participate in. So this is all about trying to improve that participation. These are the first wave of CTAP centres, but we've just interviewed and appointed the second wave as well, and we've got 14 centres, and the centres cover virtually, well, over 80% of people with CF in the UK will have the opportunity of being involved in trials, will get that information, and will have the ability to use the clinical trial coordinator. This again touches a little bit on what Mike was saying, the traditional model of cross-sectional care, of seeing somebody every 6 to 8 weeks, whether they are well or unwell. It developed in a very different era, and because of cross-infection issues, and because a lot of people now with CF are adults, and because a lot of people with CF work, it doesn't seem to make sense to see somebody with CF if they are well, and they know they are well. There seems to be a lot more sense in seeing people when they need to be seen, when they are having an exacerbation. And this is what this is all about. This is about providing people the tools with remote monitoring, so the ability to check their own lung function and their own saturation and their own sputum cultures and feed that back into the centre, and then be seen when they need to be seen rather than on a routine basis. Now, it's actually very difficult to change a model of care, but we are working with commissioners and with clinicians to try to learn how remote monitoring, Skype consultations can change that traditional model of care. And you can imagine that that might be very beneficial for areas where there's geographical challenges. Certainly in Scotland, CF Climb is one of the paediatric studies, and we are working with a network in the north of Scotland which are clearly challenged with distances, to learn how this remote monitoring may be beneficial in delivering care. And this moves us away slightly from sort of paternalistic to an empowered model of care. The CF registry, this is the database I mentioned at the beginning, is almost unique in a clinical condition. Virtually everybody with CF, I think it's 98.9% of people, have consented to have their demographic and clinical data on this database. It's entirely anonymised, so nobody can identify any one individual, but that data is there to produce the annual report, to compare centres' outcomes, to compare the national trends in terms of improvements in lung function and changes in infection status and so forth. And you can obviously divide it up any way you wish. It's got developments planned going forward. One of that is My CF Registry, and the current rollout of My CF Registry allows people with CF to enter quality of life data, and Southampton is one of the pilot centres for that, and adults in the Channel Islands who get care at Southampton can ask to be involved in that should they wish, so they can enter their own data onto the registry. And then next year and the year after, it's going to develop the facility to allow people with CF to look at their own data. So if you're an 18-year-old with CF, you can look at your lung function in comparison to other 18-year-olds and compare where you are, your own BMI, your own infection status and so forth. So benchmark yourself should you wish. I mentioned that involvement was really important to the Trust, and we have a head of principal involvement, a chap called Paul Reimer. He is very, very active in exercise programs, trying to work with young people and adolescents to encourage them to participate in exercise in the UK. But we also run something called an insight survey, where 900 children and families and young people with CF answered some questionnaire about what it's like living with CF. And if you ever wish, there's the website to look at that. It's really, really interesting to get some insight into what it's like having CF in the UK and how it affects a lot of people. And that will be run again next year as well, with a different set of questions. And we're using social media to try to reach a whole cross-section spectrum of people with CF. And they're involved in virtually every project within the CF Trust. The other big area is information and support. We provide support to people in the UK, support in the way of grants. We gave out somewhere in the region of £250,000 to about 800 people with CF last year for all sorts of things, from buying white goods to activity to holidays, to gym equipment, all sorts of different things, to emergency grants. We also have somebody called Sanjita, whose job is to help people with CF get the benefits that they're entitled to. And she sort of leveraged about £1.3 million worth of benefits for people with CF by helping them claim what they were entitled to. But that's very much UK based, and what we've heard from Mike tonight, is going to be very much more tailored and local to the Channel Islands, which is really positive. We produce a phenomenal amount of information. We produce information for clinicians, so we're working on guidelines for treating abscesses and managing abscesses. We're working on all sorts of other cross-infection guidelines. In fact, our guidelines are the most downloaded than almost any other well, certainly in the UK, but probably in the world as well. NICE have produced some recent guidelines, and we've been waiting for them, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, before we sort of tailor ours around them, because we don't want to contradict any that they've produced. And also, we produce an awful lot of information for people with CF themselves. I mentioned the fertility pack, but the school pack, the new diagnosis pack, and I know Southampton have access to all of those and issue them to a lot of people in the Channel Islands as well. But again, it's very UK based. Another big project, and again it dovetails with what Mike was saying, is a qualitative research project with University College, where we're looking at the experiences and particularly the needs of under 25s with CF and over 25s. We recognise very much that adolescent period is very, very difficult. Being an adolescent is all about growing up and becoming independent, and having a chronic condition like CF is actually quite difficult to become independent. And we're looking at ways with psychologists to try to address some of these issues, or try to help in some ways. So the CF Trust covers a massive range of different areas. We spread quite thinly, but I believe passionately that we do make a very significant difference. And certainly in my working life as a paediatrician, I think the CF Trust was very, very important in developing CF centres and CF care in the UK. So thank you. If you've got any questions, I'm more than happy to try to answer them.